Thank you, Pat, and thank you all for coming. I've really been looking forward to this. Robert and I have known each other for quite a while. This is unique in that ons kan hierdie onderhoud in Afrikaans doen, nee?
Afrikaans praten.
We're maybe two of the only Americans in government who both speak Afrikaans. He better than me, I think. But anyway, with that, before you were National Security Advisor, that's what we'll talk mostly about. But could you kind of give us your origin story, what you did before you became National Security Advisor?
Yeah, so I grew up in California, went to UCLA, so I had made a few trips out here for football games back in the old Pac-10 days. It's hard to believe the Pac-10's gone, but you're now in the Big 12 with BYU, and that's an exciting conference to be in. Was a lawyer in Los Angeles most of my career, and kind of took little turns 4 years at a time, and served in government in different positions. And Jeff and I worked on the Romney campaign. I don't talk about that a lot now in front of my new boss, my old boss, but did a couple of Romney campaigns and was Scott Walker's national security advisor, and ended up being the hostage envoy for President Trump. And that was a job of a lifetime. And that's all I thought I'd do for President Trump. And I was in Israel working on a hostage case for someone, very sadly, kind of presaging what we're seeing now. It was a IDF soldier who'd been kidnapped, killed, and dragged through the tunnels, Hayder Golden, into Gaza, and the Israelis couldn't get him back, and so they came. And President Trump had a lot of success bringing hostages home, so they said, "Could you try and work on this one?" And I was in Israel working on that, and John Bolton was fired or quit, depending on whose side of the story you believe. And I had a call to come back to Washington and interview, and ended up kind of unexpectedly being the national security advisor.
What in your career and law school and then law career, what prepared you to be a hostage negotiator?
What prepared me was doing losing presidential campaigns, because I didn't know President Trump in 2016. Again, as I mentioned, I've been with Scott, and for two glorious weeks we were leading in Iowa, and then that fell apart after the first debate in Cleveland. And but I supported President Trump in the general election, and they asked me to help out and do a few things. And I was back at home practicing law, and the office called PPO, Presidential Personnel Office, called and said, "We've got one ambassadorship left at the State Department. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. It's for hostages. It's not very prestigious. It's not going to Turkey like my friend Jeff here got to go on a big fancy ambassadorship. But we want you to do it." And I thought, I would have been Mitt Romney's national security advisor. I would have been Scott Walker's national security advisor. I don't know if I want to go do this hostage thing. And then I was actually going to walk around the Rose Bowl in the morning, working out a little bit. And I thought about it. And I got home. I talked to my wife, and I thought, I've spent a lot of my career as a lawyer overseas, doing international arbitrations and traveling around the world. And I would hope that if someone took me overseas, there'd be someone from the U.S. government that would come try and get me. And so my wife and I talked about it, and we prayed about it. And I knew some of the cases, the Austin Tice case in Syria, and Bob Levinson in Iran. And I'll give this a shot. And so I just think I was practicing law all those years and doing lots of negotiations and lots of settlement conferences. And it didn't hurt having Donald Trump, because I could always play the good cop in these negotiations to get people home. I said, "You can either deal with me or you can deal with my boss." And they usually decided to deal with me, and we got a lot of people home. But again, President Trump made it a priority, so I give him the credit for getting everyone home. But we got a lot of people home, and that's how I ended up as national security advisor. President Trump's a very metrics-driven guy, and I didn't have a senior position, but because we did get a lot of people home, it became kind of a popular, there was a lot of popular interest in what we were doing, and he saw me bringing people home, coming to the Oval Office with Americans who returned home, and so we got to know each other that way. And so he gave me a shot, and we had a good run.
Right. Tell me what you consider the biggest successes you had during that time as National Security Advisor. I mean, we can talk about the Abraham Accords and some other things, but what, in your view, was the biggest success, and then any regrets that you have that you weren't able to do?
Yeah, so the biggest success, and I'd say it goes beyond the Abraham Accords, is we really tried to, I'm kind of a peace through strength guy. I'm a hard power guy. Most of my career I've been advocating for a bigger Navy, advocating for U.S. Power abroad, which I think it brings peace and safety to our allies and our friends and to our country. But I really thought as National Security Advisor, President Trump had an opportunity to be a peacemaker. And we really focused on using his, unpredictability, using his strength to drive peace deals. And so we got the Abraham Accords. We brokered normalization between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and even Kosovo and Israel. And it was the first time since President Carter got the Jordan deal done. And of course, before then, we had Camp David with Egypt and Israel under President Carter. But it was a really major peace deal, and that's what most people focus on. But what we were working on the Abraham Accords, we were working on economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo. And so these guys have been fighting for 1,000 years. And my colleague who was ambassador to Germany, Rick Ernell, was involved in that work. And we were working on trying to get a peace deal for Afghanistan. We ultimately got a peace deal signed in Afghanistan. It didn't work out the way we'd hoped. We would have done it differently, but we set the stage for a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then we brokered a deal between, and this was even after the election that we lost, we brokered a deal between Qatar and UAE and Egypt and Saudi to heal the Gulf Rift. And so I think when I look back on what we got right at the NSC, it was getting a variety of deals to bring peace to these countries, which was ultimately in our national security interest, but it's also just there's a benefit just to humanity from having people get along and stop wars. And so that's probably the best night I had was the Baghdadi raid. And the reason for that is an Arizona named Caleb Mueller and three other great Americans, Peter Sotloff and Kasich and Foley, who were all killed by ISIS and just brutalized by al-Baghdadi. And I got to know the Mueller family well. And when we located Baghdadi and got him, we were obviously hoping to exploit the intelligence of this compound to find out where the remains of Caleb were and the other Americans who'd been beheaded by ISIS. We didn't find that, but we were able to bring justice to Baghdadi and bring a little measure of closure to those families and the Mueller family here in Arizona. So that was a good night because we were able to, bring American justice to a very bad man who'd done very terrible things to a really wonderful young woman from this state. So that was a good night, not because we took a life, but because we brought justice for Kayla.
You mentioned President Trump's unpredictability. There's the old, Nixon terms, the madman theory, that if you're at an advantage, if your opponents, your foreign adversaries don't know what you'll do or what you don't do. That maybe has its downside as well, but what are the positives of that? What did you see? You mentioned you were able to play good cop often. Yeah. If he's there, what other advantages? And let me just say one thing that I wished, I served, I'm a Republican. I was appointed by a Democrat, President Biden, to be ambassador to Turkey. There was one trait that President Trump has that Joe Biden didn't have, was just the inclination to pick up the phone, call a foreign leader, and that is often a good instinct. Usually you'll want to have a note taker, which maybe the president doesn't, but the instinct to pick up the phone and call, I think, is a good one. For example, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, we really begged the Turks to invoke the Montreux Convention to cut off Russians from being able to resupply into the Black Sea. It was a very difficult thing for the Turks to do because the Russians held grudges. And they thought this war would be over pretty quickly and then the Russians would take it out on them. But over 5 days, they did it. And I would have loved to have the president pick up the phone, call President Erdogan and say, thank you. That was tough. I know it was tough, but it was great for the alliance. And then hang up before Erdogan could ask you for anything. but that inclination, I understand it, and that is a big advantage. Do you see it that way? And what are the downsides of that unpredictability as well?
Well, so the good thing after Ukraine was that we had you there in Ankara, because with President Biden, we needed really solid ambassadors, and we got a great one in Jeff. So we were very fortunate to have you in a key post at a key time. And so thank you for your service in Turkey. And that's a very challenging post. Turkey is an American ally and a very important NATO ally, but also can be a lot. And President Erdogan can be a lot, and he's himself an unpredictable guy. I got to know him as a hostage envoy dealing with Pastor Brunson, who was an American pastor who'd been taken captive by the Turks, they were hoping to trade him for a guy named Gulen, a religious political leader that sought asylum here in the U.S. and the Turks wanted him back, and they thought if they held Brunson long enough, we'd send Gulen back in exchange for Brunson, which we weren't going to do. But they're tough negotiators. They're stubborn as can be. They dig in, but good diplomacy can work with them. You get things done, and you did a great job there. So thank you. I think there are two parts to your question. One is the unpredictability part of it, right? And so when you think about, maybe the best place where it's American unpredictability and the presidential unpredictability is built into our policy is in the Taiwan Straits. We call it strategic ambiguity. We haven't come out and said what we'll do if the PRC or the CCP invades Taiwan, the ROC, the Republic of China. So there's ambiguity there. And so the question is, with that ambiguity, you confuse the other side. You confuse your adversary. They don't know if their planners are confused. It's one thing to plan an invasion if you know it's going to be against the Taiwanese. It's another thing to plan an invasion if you think you got to take on the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. And so, being unpredictable can be a big advantage in foreign policy. And Trump was very unpredictable. I remember calling him, right after the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, and I said, I'm going to give a big speech. I was speaking at a thing called CPAC, which if you do politics is kind of a really right-wing political convention that happens every year. And I said, I'm going to call Putin a thug, and I'm going to go after Putin. And the press is going to try and make it that we broke, and that's not the case. And you were tough on Putin, but I just want to give you a heads up in case you get asked about it. And Trump said something very interesting. He said, Putin would have never invaded Ukraine if I was there. And and of course, this is the president of the United States. So at that time, the foreign president, the answer, if you're a staffer like me, is yes, sir, of course. Yeah. And he said, why? And I said, I kind of knew why, but I wanted to hear him say. He said, there was a 5% chance. I probably wouldn't have done it, but there's a 5% chance I would have sent the Marines in and kicked his butt out of there. And that risk was too much for the Russian generals to take. They wouldn't have done it. And so President Trump understood what he was doing. But the second part of your question is not so much the unpredictability; it's being willing to talk to your opponents. And sometimes we got a little bit on our high horse as Americans, saying, "Well, we're not going to talk to that person because we don't like him." Churchill was very good about this. Churchill, no one thought was an appeaser and was one of the great men of history. Said it's always better to talk than go to war. And President Trump was very good about always getting on the phone. He wanted to take all the phone calls when foreign leaders called him, even if they were from a small country. The way that the presidential phone calls work is it goes through the national security advisor. So you get advised that a foreign government wants to talk. Their ambassador, their secretariat or whatever it is calls the situation room. The situation room alerts me, and then I go and tell the president, this leader wants to talk to you. When do you want to schedule the call? And give him a briefing on what it's likely about and set up the call. He always wanted to take the calls from foreign leaders. He thought that was very important. And again, counterintuitively, he was always incredibly cordial with foreign leaders, even adversaries, probably even more so with adversaries, with Xi and with Putin. Not because he was friendly with them. They didn't have a friendship. They didn't know each other. They hadn't dined at each other's homes. They didn't know each other's families. But he thought it was very important to, especially with the big nuclear powers and folks that could do us harm, was to be able to have a line of communication with them. So he was always very cordial and very proper with them. Now, the art of diplomacy, I think, is being able to say the nastiest possible things in the nicest possible way. And so we were cutting off Nord Stream 2. We were putting big sanctions on the pipeline from Russia to Germany, which was the biggest economic program the Russians had. It was their lifeline. And it was Putin's #1 foreign policy objective was to get Nord Stream 2 going. And we were going to sanction it. And the president said, I better call Putin and tell him myself. And I thought that was courageous that he didn't want to just, let us do it. So he called Putin and he said, I won't imitate the president. I'll get in trouble. But He said, Vladimir, you're so smart and you're such a great leader, and you've got this country and 11 time zones and so big, and you're governed so well and everything. And we're gonna, by the way, my advisors tell me I've got to stop this Nord Stream 2. I'm sure you understand it's bad for us, bad for Western Europe, and I know that's going to be upsetting to you, but you'll figure out a way around it, and because you're so terrific, you're so great. Listen, I got to go. Thanks a lot, Vladimir. Just keep doing great things for the Russian people. And he hangs up, and I'm thinking, what the hell was the Russian interpreter thinking when he said, "You're the greatest guy in the world. We're canceling Nord Stream 2, but you'll figure it out. Take care. Call me anytime." And so sometimes delivering a nasty message in a nice way is a good skill, and I know you had to do that as an ambassador a lot. Probably as a senator as well.
Yeah, mostly. Keeping with the Russia-Ukraine kind of theme, negotiations are happening now. You've been in those rooms. Tell us what's going on. What do you expect to happen in the coming weeks and months?
So what I expect to happen is we'll probably have some sort of freeze at the current lines, which isn't great because in some ways you're rewarding Russia for having invaded twice, and as President Trump would say, both under Biden and Obama. But putting that aside, you don't want to reward the Russians, but the facts are the facts on the ground. I mean, they control the ground. We're not sending American troops in. We're not going to get into a situation where we could escalate and have a war with Russia that could lead to nuclear exchange. The Ukrainians themselves, their economy is in really bad shape. They're running out of men and material. I mean, even if we kept giving them, missiles and rockets and tanks and aircraft, there are not enough Ukrainians to fight the war, and they're outnumbered 3-1. It's a very bad situation for Ukraine. So we've got to end the war around the table. We've got to get a negotiated peace deal with them. It's no one's going to like it. It's unfortunate. And you hate to reward the Russians even one little bit for what they've done. But my guess is you'll have that happen. Now, people are concerned about President Trump and, the famous Zelensky meeting with J.D. Vance in the Oval Office, which was pretty epic. I'd never seen anything like that before. But President Trump is trying to do something. He's the only person that can mediate this peace deal. He's the only person that can bring the parties together and get the deal done. If we're seen by the Russians as being on the Ukraine side, we're never going to be able to mediate a deal. And as a lawyer, I can't tell you how many times I had judges who I knew well and were friendly with, and they'd walk in and say, "Oh, Brian, you've got the worst case in the world. It's terrible. You're going to lose. You're going to get killed. You got to settle it right now. I'm going to help you settle it, and you owe me. But your case is terrible." Now, the only solace I had is I know he was walking to the other party and saying, "Hey, you got the worst case in the world. O'Brien's going to kill you. Settle down." Trump is trying to develop a little space where he can be seen as a neutral party and bring the parties together at the table. We couldn't do it if we were totally for Ukraine. Now, he's got Witkoff, and this is something classic Trump. He's got Witkoff over in Russia and Moscow talking to Putin, developing a relationship there. He's got Keith Kellogg, who I worked with, who was Vice President Pence's national security advisor, and was a really good man, good general. He's over with Zelensky and with the Ukrainians, talking to the Ukrainians. So we've got avenues to both sides. I think Zelensky was a little reticent to come to the talks, and he got pushed around a little, and he's now at the table. But now Putin, which I personally always expected Putin to be a big problem to get him to the table to negotiate in good faith, because the Russians are they're very difficult to negotiate with. I had to negotiate with them over hostages, over the New START treaty. I think they're probably the toughest negotiators I dealt with, more than the Iranians, more than the Chinese, more than the Venezuelans. I mean, the Russians, if you give them anything, they take it and put it in their pocket. You get no goodwill for giving them anything. Everything has to be a quid pro quo, this or that, because if you give them any goodwill at all, they just say, "Yeah, you owe us that because you ruined our empire. You caused the fall of the Soviet Union. You did this, you did that." And so they're very, very difficult negotiators, and we're gonna have our work cut out for us. It's gonna be a hard job.
Moving to another big conflict, Gaza. How does this end?
All the easy ones.
Yeah.
This is why when I wake up in the morning, I'm happy that Mike Waltz is there and I'm not there. It's a lot of mornings I get up in the morning and don't miss being at the White House.
But how does this one end?
Look, everything. just like Russia's the root of all the problems, or many of the problems in Europe, Iran is the root of these problems in the Middle East. And until we deal with Iran, we're not going to have peace in the Middle East. We got partway there with the Abraham Accords, and we're starting to, and I think the Accords will get expanded. I think Saudi, the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will get involved in the Accords, and I think you're going to build a coalition against Iran. But as long as Iran is sponsoring terrorism like they were doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, the Syrian regime under Assad, it's a very difficult situation. And they hate Israel. The Iranians want to destroy Israel. They have for many years. They've called Israel a one-bomb country, that they could detonate one nuclear weapon near Israel and destroy it, have a second Holocaust, destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. So the way we get to peace with Palestine and Israel, the way we get to peace in the Middle East is by bringing Iran into line, and it's very difficult with the current regime, because the regime is not motivated like the Chinese are motivated by Marxist-Leninism and Chinese nationalism. The Russians, Putin wants to restore the Russian Empire. The Turks want to in some ways restore the Ottoman Empire. The Iranians are motivated by theology and a belief that the 12th Mahdi is going to return. And they believed in their hearts that they can usher the return of the 12th Mahdi by creating chaos and war in the Middle East. And so it's a very difficult ideology to deal with and to negotiate with, and to try and come up with an accord with the Iranians. And so, we'll see. President Trump has given them 2 months notice to either get rid of their nuke or face the consequences. They are negotiating. Witkoff is going back to Rome this weekend. So we'll see what happens. But ultimately, the way you get to peace in the Middle East is dealing with Iran, and that's not an easy job.
How will that be different from what President Obama did? I mean, I was in the Senate during that time. I didn't like that deal. I voted against it. I thought that, one, you've got to not just deal with the nuclear issue, but you have to deal with Iran's malevolent behavior in the region with their proxies. And that agreement did nothing on that side. Iran's proxy situation, they're losing out. I mean, they've lost Hamas, they've lost Hezbollah, they're weakened in Syria.
They've lost Assad in Syria. I mean, they've really taken it on the chin.
They have. And so we're different going in there. So will this be more than just a nuclear discussion? How do you expect this? You have experience with Iran. I don't think they've erected any statues for you in the country. But
there's a fatwa against me. So and a criminal case in the Tehran Superior Court or criminal court. So no, they're not fans.
But how is this going to be different? And my own opinion is I'm glad he's talking. I'm glad that going back to negotiations, and but I'm just wondering how it's going to be any different than what we got before.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because President Trump railed against the JCPOA and the Iran nuclear deal for 4 years. And then Witkoff had his first meeting. I think Steve's a very good negotiator. He's a nice guy. I've got to know him recently. He's done very, went from being a lawyer to making a lot of money in real estate in New York. And you're not going to do tougher negotiations, anywhere than negotiating over, real estate in New York. So I think he's well prepared to do tough negotiations. But after the first weekend in Oman, I think both the Iranians and at least some of the leaks on the U.S. side sounded a lot like the JCPOA. It sounded like the outline was pretty similar. And so you had people like Mark Levin and others came up very hard against it on, at least on TV. And I think you had some folks at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, FDD, and some of the other think tanks were hitting it pretty hard. So I think Witkoff has walked back some of the comments that made it look like the JCPOA was the starting point. But I think you're 100% right. The Iranians are going full speed ahead with ballistic missiles, with drones, which we're seeing being used in Ukraine. They're trying to build a navy. They're operating across the whole region with proxies in places like Yemen with the Houthis and Iraq. So unless you deal with the whole issue of the malign behavior, you're not going to solve the Iran problem. And right now, the negotiations look pretty focused just on the nuclear issue. So we'll have to see what happens, how it comes out. Now, I think the Iranians may be making a mistake because since 1979, the Iranians have out negotiated us at every turn, Republicans and Democrats. I mean, everybody from Reagan, first Carter, then Reagan, all the way down. They're survivors. The regime has survived. The regime is actually pretty unpopular in Iran, but they survived. Part of it has been the nuclear program, like in North Korea, that's given them a raise on debt to keep going. But I think they've got something different with President Trump this time, and I'm not sure they understand what's different. He's going to implement his program, and they've got Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump, and both Bibi and Donald have been through lawfare and trials and impeachments, and October 7th in Bibi's case, neither of them are messing around. I'm not sure the Iranians understand what they're up against. If I was the Iranians, I'd look for whatever deal I could get as fast as I could, because if they don't, I think they're going to face terrible consequences.
Moving on to China, President Trump, his mind, his policies. How is he going to effectively deter China from going after Taiwan? You mentioned, the chance that he thinks he'll face the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That obviously is deterrent. But what is the Trump administration likely to do in an effort to deter Iran?
Yes, I think that's
deter China.
China, the PRC, and really within the PRC, it's the CCP. The Politburo, and at this point, it's down to one guy, Xi. I mean, we haven't seen this in China since Mao. We have somebody who, in President Xi or Chairman Xi or General Secretary Xi, whatever you want to call him, who has amassed total power. He's in his third term. I assume he's going to stay there for life. You saw at the last party Congress, he had Hu Jintao, who was a prior leader. They went down and got him out of his seat and escorted him out of the Congress in front of everybody. It wasn't quite Saddam style where he'd be shot in front of everybody, but it was the Chinese equivalent of that. So Xi has total power. His number one priority is to reunite more than economics. Deng and some of these guys were more economic focused and wanted to raise the Chinese people up out of poverty. Xi's number one objective is to reunite Taiwan, which he thinks will be kind of the capstone on ending the century of humiliation, that China will be whole again. So it's a very important goal of his. We've got to try and deter it. I mean, for many reasons. Geopolitically, Taiwan is incredibly important. It's right in the first island chain. It separates Japan and South Korea, our Northern Asian allies, from our Southern Asian allies, the Philippines, and then Australia, New Zealand, and Thailand. It would give Chinese boomers, their ballistic missile submarines, total access to the Pacific. All the islands that we were concerned about in World War II would be, we'd be talking about Wake and Midway and Nauru and Palau, and we would be talking about places we haven't talked about since the 1940s. So geopolitically, it's difficult if they get Taiwan for America. I mean, the whole West Coast is open: California, Oregon, Washington. But you've also got TSMC, and that's the big difference. That the Taiwanese chip maker, TSMC, makes 90% of the small nanometer chips, the 2 and 3 nanometer chips that we use.
A lot of them here in Arizona now.
They're coming here, which will be good when we get it built, but it's still a few years off. So you can imagine if the Chinese took over Taiwan now and got all the TSMC chip making, they would control the world economy. Just flat out. NVIDIA, everybody, by Apple, everyone gets their advanced chips from TSMC. They're the only ones who could do it. They got the secret sauce. And until we, build an alternative, supply chain here in America, Taiwan is it. And if the Chinese got a hold of Taiwan, it would be devastating for the world economy. And it would put China really in the catbird seat with AI, quantum, all the batteries, autonomous vehicles, UAVs, green energy. But they control the whole future. And so I just don't think we can allow it to happen. And then the third thing is the Taiwanese are just nice people. I don't know if has anyone ever been to Taiwan? When the people have been there, it's my favorite place in Asia. It's a wonderful place. It's relaxed. They're hardworking. They're like Americans. It's a great democracy. They go back and forth between the parties every 4 or 8 years. It's a wonderful place, and to see those people all lose their freedom just because a megalomaniac like Xi wants to take him over and add to his own glory, his personal legacy and his personal glory. Is that would be a shame in and of itself. So there are a lot of reasons that we need to stay tough on Taiwan. Sorry for the long answer, Jeff, but
nope. Big problem, long answer. That's
but how do you deter them? I mean, the way we deter them is we've got to have enough military force that when Xi goes to his army, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and the People's Liberation Army Navy, and the People's Liberation Army Air Force, they tell them we can't win. Now, right now, they're pretty close to probably being able to win. Either, and of course, Taiwan's reunification either through a Normandy style or maybe closer analogies, a Sicily style invasion, amphibious invasion, or through a blockade. Within the next 2 to 3 years, we've got some incredible, exquisite systems that we're going to deploy. Air-based UAVs, underwater UAVs, sensor platforms, targeting platforms with companies like Palantir and Anduril and Northrop. We've got some amazing things. So I think in 2 or 3 years, the Chinese are going to be deterred. What concerns me is, number one, the tariff war. They may realize there's nothing left to fight. There's no reason to appease us. And by the way, I support decoupling from China, but we've got that issue. But they also know they're not stupid. They know we're going to be in a position to deploy. Biden called it the replicator program. I don't know what Trump will call it, but Admiral Paparo, who I had dinner with the other night, the commander of Indo-PACOM, said, if the Chinese invade, I'm going to turn the Taiwan Straits into a hellscape for the Chinese military and Navy. I mean, there's no way they're going to pass. And we're going to be in a position to make good on that threat very soon. And so what concerns me is as far as flashpoints around the world, is that if China goes after Taiwan in the next 2 years, that could end us up in World War III. And that's your big, the thing you want to avoid the most is National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, or SecDef, or President. No one wins in World War III. Especially I've got 2 kids in the military, so we want to avoid that.
Well, typically for a National Security Advisor, trade doesn't really fall into that, but when tariffs are justified as a national security issue, then it kind of moves into the realm. When I was in the Senate during the first Trump term, I spoke out a lot against the Section 232 tariffs being used for aluminum and steel and whatnot. I can't imagine what I'd be doing now. It's gone so far beyond the whole tariff thing.
It's so quaint that you're a free trader.
Yeah, I thought that's what we were.
I remember that used to be a GOP position.
Yeah, that times have changed, I guess. But I can you explain? I think all of us recognize the issue with China. We've got to have decreased reliance, critical minerals, you name it. But it would seem that the best case would be to team up with our allies and then go after China. But it seems to a lot of people that we're kind of ticking off a lot of our allies, and then we're going to face China. And is that a concern, or is there something that those of us who kind of think that aren't seen? What do you think?
So I think the good news up front is that we're going to have we're going to get some great deals, really good deals for America very soon with our big allies. I think we're going to see a deal with South Korea. I think we're going to see a deal with Japan. I think we're going to see a deal with Taiwan. I think we're going to see a deal with the UK, probably Australia. New Zealand sells too much dairy, so I don't know if we'll get a deal with New Zealand, but we're going to have some good deals very quickly. And I think India, we're going to have a very good deal with India. And I think that's going to, it may not have been intended this way, but I think it is going to isolate China along the lines you're pointing out. It's kind of an unorthodox way to get there. It was pretty disruptive. Liberation Day was disruptive. I saw that the congressman from Texas has introduced a bill to make it a national holiday. So
Liberation Day is a national holiday.
I guess it depends on how you feel about it, but there are kind of 4 justifications for tariffs that have, and I think it reflects some of the factions in the administration. One justification is national security. So you've got China selling fentanyl precursors to Mexican cartels, and we want them to stop the fentanyl because it's killing Americans, or we want the NATO countries to meet their Wales pledge We don't want to continue to defend Germany if they won't pay their fair share, or defend Canada. So you can put tariffs on Canada to get them to deploy more ships to the Arctic and spend more on their defense. Those are kind of a one-off thing. It's kind of a use of a trade authority to get something else. So you're trying to get a national security outcome. And in general, I'm in favor of that, if it's used properly. And so, but that's not going to be across the board. Then you got people who want to use tariffs to raise money and have an external revenue service. And I tweeted something out, and you've always got to be careful going on Twitter. I said, free and fair trade and reciprocity is great. Countries that have been, treating Americans unfairly, eliminate your tariffs, eliminate your non-tariff trade barriers, and for American, companies and exporters, we'll do the same. We'll have a great free and fair trade relationship. And my Twitter line filled up with people saying, we don't want free and fair trade. We want an external revenue service so we don't have to pay income taxes anymore. So some pretty hardcore, mega Republicans were coming after me because they didn't like the reciprocity policy, but that's a policy of President Trump. I mean, so you've got the revenue raising, idea. Then you've got manufacturing, and how can we use tariffs to build kind of a moat around America and encourage companies to come back to America and manufacture. Bring the Rust Belt back, bring furniture production in North Carolina back. Whether we can do that or not, we'll have to see. I think we can do a lot along those lines. But in the last 10 years, we've lost 90,000 factories, not 90,000 jobs, 90,000 factories to China. I mean, they've hollowed out the interior, and a lot of Wall Street guys have made money buying companies, selling the IP and selling the machinery to China, and then having slave labor or cheap labor, build the same things in China that we were building here. And they've wiped out communities. And you go through some of these places in the Midwest and on the East Coast, it's heartbreaking. And you see there was a very good book a couple of years ago by Charles Murray called Coming Apart, which talked about the difference between college towns like here, or LA, where I'm from, or New York, or Provo or Austin, and these smaller towns around the country, and how difficult these communities have been hit by losing the factory. Maybe there's a one factory town, maybe there's a two or three factory town. So there's this idea that we'll use tariffs to bring back manufacturing to America. And then the last one is reciprocity. It's just there's a certain unfairness that, and maybe this worked for 10 years after World War II, where the Germans can charge 10% tariffs on our car manufacturers, and we charge 2.5% tariffs on the Germans. I mean, this has been going on. They've been ripping us off for 50 years now. And there was a time when that was maybe appropriate, like in the 50s, when we were trying to build the West German economy back up and have bulwarks against communism and give the people of Europe or Japan a better life. But that ended a long time ago. Germany doesn't have a trade deficit. We've got $36 trillion in trade deficits here, or in a fiscal deficit in America. I mean, it's getting to the point where the balance sheet doesn't even line up. Even if we sold Yosemite and Yellowstone, all that sort of thing, we couldn't pay down our national debt. We're paying more in interest this year on our national debt, $1 trillion, and we're going to spend on defense. So it's just unfair that we do that and defend Germany. It's unfair that a teacher in Tennessee, a single mom, is teaching class and then having to work the weekends at an Amazon fulfillment house, to make ends meet. And, a German guy is working 35 hours a week and taking August off, and we're paying for their defense. I mean, so we've got to get back to some basic fairness and burden sharing with our allies. And that's where the reciprocity comes in. So if they don't want to buy Chevrolets, that's fine, but they don't have to put an extra penalty on Chevrolet, or if they would. But I'm told by a lot of Germans they'd buy a Ford Raptor if they could, a F-150. So maybe we can compete. If the VAT goes away and the tariffs go away. But again, and that by the way, most Americans understand that. It's like Americans want fairness. I think they're willing to match our products and match our ingenuity and our productivity up against the world. And I think that's the popular thing. And that's, I think, where the president came down on the tariffs, is this idea of reciprocal trade, free and what we used to call free and fair trade in the Reagan days. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the president is. But I think there are still some people that have other ideas for the tariffs. And mm-hmm. I'm not sure those are economically viable or even popular with the American people.
Right. Who's the most underestimated world leader out there?
That's a good question. So I'll go to Africa, where I've spent a lot of time in our youth. I think Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, is an incredibly smart guy. He's done amazing things for Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the few countries in Africa that has no natural resources, no minerals, no oil, no gas. It's probably the cleanest country in Africa. So you can walk around there at midnight. You can walk around Kigali, the capital of the country, and it's clean. He's got a highly effective military, which he gets in trouble for maybe using in the DRC next door from time to time. He's a pretty incredible leader, and he's helped the country recover from probably the worst genocide that we've seen, a really down and dirty genocide in which neighbors were killing neighbors with machetes, and it was an awful thing. So I've been to Rwanda a few times. Really impressed with him. The problem is, he wins re-election with like 96% of the vote every time. So I kind of said, hey, Paul, Mr. President, could you, win with like 89%, next time. Like, it's not my fault I'm so popular. But, with a lot of strong leaders, there's always, and you have this with Erdogan in Turkey. He's popular. He'd certainly win, re-election easily. And maybe he's winning with 95% of the vote. But, there's always a concern that they become the indispensable man in their country. But what he inherited, what he's taken over, and what he's done for Rwanda, I think is nothing short of a miracle. And if you ever get a chance to go to Rwanda, go see the gorillas, and you have to book like a year ahead of time. But it's a great place to go visit.
If you're in the Situation Room and you're expecting a call on the red phone from some world leader, what do you, as National Security Advisor, fear the most? Something in the Middle East, something with Russia, something with China, or something else?
So the people used to ask me, well, that question basically, what's the biggest threat we face as a country? And so, my concern every day was what Iran was going to do. Were they going to kill an American soldier? Were we going to lose people to get hostages taken? We're going to lose a base. Were they going to try and overrun one of our embassies, which they were trying to do in Baghdad at the time that we had the operation at the Baghdad airport with Soleimani to restore deterrence in the Middle East. So that was kind of the day-to-day problem. The existential threat to us, I think, is China going after Taiwan. I mean, that's the sort of thing that could escalate into a nuclear exchange. And you get the nuclear briefing. It's the most sobering part of taking the job. On your first day on the job, you get a nuclear briefing on what our plans are and what the military aide with the football has, and it contains our nuclear plans and counterstrike plans, and the number of people that would die worldwide in a nuclear exchange is you can't comprehend it. It's a very sobering thing. But then so that's what you're kind of worried about, China and Iran kind of day to day. And I think it was the same for Jake Sullivan, for Biden. I think it was the same for Mike Waltz now. But then you have COVID, shows up, and you face a worldwide pandemic, and that was on no one's bingo card. And fortunately, I had a deputy who, Matt Pottinger, who was a China specialist and was my deputy national security advisor. And we started looking at this in December. The balloon really didn't go up until late January. And we kept asking the agency, and the intel guys were missing it. And again, I'm not blaming them. It just seemed like another avian flu or, SARS or something. And we thought this was going to be pretty big, and it changed all of our lives, in a way that no one expected. So it's kind of the unexpected thing that you.
Yep.
And let me just add one thing to it, Senator, is that the worst call you get as national security advisor is when an American soldier is killed overseas or in a training accident, either in combat or in training. The call goes to the national security advisor first, and then you have to decide, whether to go tell a president or wake him up if it's in the middle of the night. But you're called immediately. Those are the toughest days on the job, because you just know a family, a wife, parents, they've had their life irrevocably changed because we've lost some great young American in been shot down or killed in Afghanistan or died in a training accident, and you're going to end up a week or two at Dover trying to comfort that family at the dignified transfer that remains, and those are the really tough days. It's not a threat to America. It's not existential to our existence as a country.
Difficult. Yeah.
But for that family, it's an existential, changes their lives forever.
Definitely. On the flip side, being able to bring home a hostage, you have the opposite relief on the family's part, and you've done both. There are students here who are looking to go into some field in national security, foreign service. You were in their position at one point. What do you wish you would have studied more or done less?
Well, it won't be true confessions here, but look, I should have studied a foreign language. I speak Afrikaans as Jeff does, and I've actually
There's a lot of use for that around the world.
It's surprisingly, I have used it a couple of times.
I did too. I say that, but I went to Namibia for a year.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I did use it in diplomacy actually, and I did an internal investigation for a company. We had to go to Johannesburg for a big international mining company and use it. But I should have learned how to speak French or Spanish. I mean, one thing I think I'm pretty smart, but you're in a meeting. My French is like good enough to kind of follow what's going along and kind of at least get the subject matter. But if I intervene or say something, it's like a toddler speaking, and like a not very bright toddler, so it's like, well,
the French are a lot less tolerant than the Afrikaners if you butcher the language.
True, but look, I should say French or Spanish or Portuguese, one of the Chinese, one of the big languages, Russian. That's something I had the capacity to do. I have no capacity for math or physics, but I should probably take in a physics class. I spent my whole time at UCLA. You could take science classes or things pass no pass. So I wanted to make sure my GPA was high enough to get a decent law school. So I spent more time figuring out like what basket weaving class I could take, and to get an A rather than like taking a beginner physics class or some of the harder science classes. So that would have been good to have in hindsight. But most importantly, with my facilities, I was never going to win any math contests. But yeah, I should have probably spent a little more time on getting a third language.
What in hiring people for positions that answered to you, what traits would you look for, character traits or skills or abilities when you were hiring?
Yeah, so I've hired a lot of people over the years. I was managing partner of a big national law firm, and then in government, the State Department, and your old stomping grounds and at the White House. And I kind of look for four things, and this is none of it's novel. You want smart people. Smart men and women, because it's like train speed. You can't train speed. You can't train, jumping ability. You got to get, for a law firm, for the national, for the White House, you got to have people that are smart. So that's number one. Number two, you need hard workers. I mean, there's a lot of smart people that don't want to work hard, and you've got to grind. And the job, especially at the White House here, it's a 24/7 job at the National Security Council. Most people only last a year or two or three because that's all they can take of it. It's a tough job. But then the other thing is I gave a commencement speech at Pepperdine a couple of years ago, and I called it my Tim McGraw speech. He had a song called "Humble and Kind," and Washington's a pretty mean place, and but the people I was most impressed with and who got the most done were people that were kind and be humble. And it's not a false modesty. It's not that they're not smart or hardworking or very good at what they do, but you're facing such a range of issues. When I was National Security Advisor, I created a list of the top 10 things I need to worry about every day to keep the country safe. The first three were quantum, AI, and hypersonics. And trust me, my science degree was in political science. It was not in real science. And so you have to be humble enough to know that there are experts on these, and a really good expert is somebody who knows it cold but can explain it to at a fifth grade level, which is what I needed. And you got to be humble enough to get the best people and to know when you're out of your depth and need to get people that are expert in the area. Turkey. I mean, I had to deal with the Turks all the time. I was never a Turkish expert. So you have to have a level of humility to be good at these jobs. So those are kind of the four things. Smart, grinders, never give up. Being humble, and then just being a decent person. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Washington, and this is on both sides of the aisle. This is not a criticism of my Democrat friends or my GOP friends, but it's the city, and you can comment on this as well. With your point, I just think I've been going there since I was an intern for Pete Wilson in the RNC back in 1984, and it's just gotten meaner and meaner every 5 years it seems like, and that's unfortunate.
It has, most definitely. You mentioned
People like you.
Well, talk about,
you just get ingrained with being nice to senators because your whole career is dependent on the Senate confirming you. So you always want to be deferential to the
well, that was the odd thing.
The members of the House of Lords, as we call them.
I had both sides of that. I sat in judgment of a lot of nominees coming through, ambassadors and judges, and then I had to get on the other side of the dais and beg my former colleagues to let me through. And so what goes around comes around. That's one thing that I've learned in my career. You never want to anger somebody who will be in a position of judgment later on. So, and another thing is, I took a lot of congressional delegation trips when I was in the Senate and the House. A lot of people call them boondoggles, but you travel around the world. I probably went to 70 or 80 countries in the 18 years I was there. And then when I became ambassador, I deal with those congressional delegations coming to the country. I can't tell you how many times I apologized for, and hoping I wasn't as high maintenance as some of these senators that we dealt with. So anyway, but talking about you talk about your family for a minute. You mentioned it's difficult. It's gotten meaner in Washington. How does that affect your family? I think you and I will probably agree on this.
No, well, you saw this with your wife Cheryl and with Blow Marie, my wife. We're pretty thick-skinned. So you're used to criticism. You're used to colleagues criticizing. You're used to being criticized by some senator who you don't know is talking about or congressman is yelling on cable news about you like he knows you and you're just the worst person in the world. And or you read something in the newspaper about a meeting you were in and it totally misrepresents what happened and you think, who leaked that? That's just plain untrue. But you get used to it and you deal with it as part of the job. It's kind of occupational hazard. It's tough when you come home though at night and your wife, who's been home all day, kind of watching CNN or watching X or Twitter or whatever, and it's like, man, can you believe this? And half the time I wouldn't even know what happened. Can you believe what so and so said about you? And I said, well, it's not that bad, but your wife and kids take it more personally and. There was some totally ridiculous rumors that I was going to run for president this last time around. It was never going to happen, but there were a few articles about it. And my two daughters were frantically calling saying, "Dad, don't run for president." And then I showed up on some of the lists for vice president. Again, I was like the Republican to be named later. They had to have a list of 10. They had like 9 legitimate candidates, and threw my name on to there was an even 10. But my daughters were pretty adamant that I not do something like that. Not that I was going to be asked, but. This whole thing can be tough on the family.
It can be. Well, let me just say we've run out of time. But during the first Trump term, I was in the Senate for part of that time, and then post-Senate, I wasn't always complimentary of the president. I've had my differences with him, but I was always comforted in the fact that you were there, where you were, and I always appreciated the thoughtful way that you treated foreign policy. And when I got to Turkey, dealing with our hosts there, they talked about you a lot in a very positive way. Somebody who is fair and thoughtful and knowledgeable. And that's the Robert O'Brien I know. And I appreciate your service to the country, and I know that it will continue.
Well, coming from you, that means the world to me. And your resume, has anyone here seen The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance? No one's seen it? Okay, your homework assignment, you've seen it in the back. The main character is played by Jimmy Stewart. On a train ride back to Arizona, they talk about his career. He's a governor and senator and ambassador, and he's got a resume like yours. I mean, no one's got a resume like Jeff Flake, and you've done great work for the country, and you've served the country ably and well, and I'm proud of you. And it's been a pleasure in a few instances to work with you. And so thanks for having me here. And you guys are fortunate to have me at the School of Public Policy here. It's an Institute of Politics. It's a blessing for your constituents in Arizona that you're still in the game. So thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking Robert O'Brien for coming here today. Thank you.